The answer is, it depends. Hi everyone, and welcome to Exploring the Build. If you've just found this place, then welcome. And if you're returning, I am glad to have you back. I'm Alex, and this is my channel where we explore and theory craft different character builds for Dungeons & Dragons. Normally we'd be doing a single character build, or maybe a couple mini character builds. But today, we're mixing things up. See, the concept for today's video came from David C. 9005, who asked to see the best archer build in terms of highest DPS, or in this case, DPR, damage per round, because we are a turn-based game, not an action game. I went to confirm if this best archer was to use a bow, a crossbow, or any other specific weapon, and really, it's dealer's choice, so that leaves us with a couple different options to do. And I also went back to check if 2014 or 2024 rules were the way to go, and why not, we're doing 2024 rules. 2024 with changes to ranged combat just kind of felt like the right thing to explore in terms of DPR archer builds. Now, as silly as the answer within the first second of this video sounded, it actually is kind of true. Really get into the nitty-gritty of why that answer is, I'm going to structure the video a bit differently, which you may have noticed by the timestamps or length of the video. Basically, what we're doing is one big damage report with a whole bunch of different builds. Now, if you're familiar with my channel, you know that damage reports aren't something I typically do. Today, though, we're going to actually push that limit. Now, I did this by using Ludic Savant's damage calculator, which is free and available online, and I will put a link to in the description below. So if you want to check it out for yourself, definitely go ahead. None of the actual formulas or math are my own. All I was doing was punching in numbers into a calculator and then hitting go. However, knowing me, I will say a little disclaimer that I could have gotten that wrong as well. Please just take it with a grain of salt. Now, before we actually talk about what I did for the builds and the video and how I was approaching this question entirely, let me just say that even though we are looking for the best archer in terms of DPR, we're not making this a tier list video or a ranking video or anything like that. I prefer to think of this as more of an experiment to see just how different builds can stack up by using DPR as a solid metric. But really, what we're looking to see is how capable different builds in 2024 are of being the best archer that they can be. With all that said, let's actually look at what the heck I did to make this video. First off, we need to define what an archer is for our build. To me, an archer build is a character that is specifically using some type of bow weapon. Like how I went back and asked in the request, was there a specific weapon to use? Even though it was dealer's choice, I'm still restricting us just to bow weapons. So longbow, shortbow, crossbows. No guns, no thrown weapons, anything like that. I'm considering this to only focus on the damage we can deal from the weapon. So even though an archer build could throw in some extra damage from external sources, like some terrain spells, no Beastmaster, no other summons, we just want to focus on how much damage we can output with our weapon. Anything else that we would take from those other builds would just be icing on the cake if you decided to play them. I have, however, taken into consideration things that boost our damage with the weapon or maybe get tacked on after an attack. Stuff like Hunter's Mark, Battlemaster maneuvers, the Great Weapon Master fighting style, and other things like that. The other thing about asking the question, what is the best archer, is that it's really two separate questions. The first question is what weapon has the potential to deal the most DPR, and two, what build could possibly be the most effective with that weapon. We know that I am restricting this to just bows and crossbows, but I'm going to restrict that even further by only looking at the longbow, the heavy crossbow, and the hand crossbow. The longbow and the heavy crossbow both get Great Weapon Master, whereas the shortbow and light crossbow do not. Whereas the hand crossbow has the light property to get to use an offhand attack as a bonus action, and then you can improve the damage with that from Crossbow Expert. I made a handful of builds and then looked at the DPR that each of those builds would have with each of those three weapons. So there is quite a lot to take into account here. Now, since we know what weapons I used, what builds or classes did I actually use and consider to be ranged archer builds? Well, to be brutally honest, I made a champion fighter with 1 level dip in Ranger, a pure Eldritch Knight, a Battle Master, again with 1 dip in Ranger, a pure Hunter Ranger, as well as a pure Gloomstalker, a rogue build that didn't really have any specific subclass at first, we'll get to that later, and a monk as a bit of an homage to our bow monk build from last week. Now, a few things to note here. I did not use any 2014 subclasses. That was mainly because I wanted to see what the 2024 PHB had to offer and sort of constrained myself there, but I still did use 2014 feats and a couple other features in the builds just to add some extra power to the DPR of that build. Obviously, this means that there might be some 2014 subclasses that really excel now in 2024 that I completely overlooked. If you have a soft spot for a specific subclass or build that you think could be the best overall archer, maybe it'll be a hidden gem. Also, one major caveat for all you longbow fans out there. The numbers for the longbow are slightly off. This is because in the calculator, I did not know how to input the piercer feat, which I took at every opportunity I could for the longbow. The piercer feat does let you re-roll piercing damage that you deal once per turn. That was the part that I didn't know where to put into the calculator, but the extra damage on the critical hit I was able to throw in, so the damage is off a little bit, but not by an extreme amount, I don't think. Now we know what builds I did, what weapons I used, why we're doing this in the first place. How did I actually physically compare them? Because 20 levels of like 7 builds is quite a lot. Well, obviously I constrained that a little bit. We omitted some subclasses and some other builds for that reason, but also I omitted a lot of levels. I assumed all builds were at level 8. I felt that this was the best to compare builds because level 8 is a reasonable level that I think most tables achieve. It's not super high tier, we're midway through tier 2, levels 5 to 10, so I think that's fair. And in terms of 2024, in my mind, it is where most builds come together. In my mind, level 8 is where a lot of characters are really going to be hitting their stride in terms of getting their play style that they're building for onto the table. Keep in mind, this means that we have our first variable. Some builds are going to end up performing better at lower levels than they will at the higher levels, and vice versa. Our second variable is the armor class. I picked the target AC to be 18 because I felt that was a reasonable, tough enemy to try and consistently hit. Now, that means our second variable is how well our builds are going to stack up against higher AC targets, since technically 18 AC is a little bit of a higher AC. And really that will skew our numbers slightly. It'll be pretty obvious how that works, but we'll of course talk about it during the builds. Now the final micro assumptions to mention, if a build has any setup abilities like Hunter's Mark or anything like that, I assumed that we already had a turn to do all those setups and we're just looking at the raw damage we could do in a vacuum, so obviously it's still going to be a little unrealistic. I also assumed that we weren't killing the enemy and then having to move on to the next target and redo those setups. That also is unrealistic, but I like to think of it as us looking at these builds, shooting a practice dummy in like a training arena of a video game. All we're focused on is the consistent damage per round that we can achieve in a perfect world. For the actual DPR, I used 3 rounds to calculate a total DPR. I used the calculator, got the damage per round for a single round, and then extrapolated that for 3 rounds of combat. However, if there were characters that had extra abilities that could be considered burst damage, like Battle Master maneuvers or anything like that, basically we have 1 turn of burst damage and 2 turns of just shooting an enemy, or if we're using a consistent damage build, 3 rounds of dealing that consistent damage. And of course the elephant in the burst damage room is Action Surge. This might seem a little weird, but I did not actually account for Action Surge in these builds. I felt that Action Surge would be a big push in favor of fighters, and I didn't want that to necessarily be reflected in the numbers. Obviously, you can use Action Surge for dealing damage, and that's perfectly fine. That means that any of our fighter builds are going to have a much higher damage per round than what is presented here. Action Surge could be used as a utility maneuver, or it might not be available every fight, and I wanted to reflect that rather than using the biggest burst feature in the game to boost some builds' DPR. With all that said, we got a lot of builds to get through, so let's get going. First up is our champion fighter. Looking at the 3 builds, we have our hand crossbow build, heavy crossbow, and longbow. They're all fairly similar. The hand crossbow is fighter 7, ranger 1 with the origin feat of lucky, and then crossbow expert as well as elven accuracy, and that level 1 ranger dip does get them hunter's mark. Heavy crossbow also went into hunter's mark and kept crossbow expert as their feat, but they grab Great Weapon Master since that can improve their damage, as the heavy crossbow is of course a heavy weapon. And then for both the heavy crossbow and the longbow, I did not assume an origin feat. I assumed lucky for the hand crossbow because that helps us basically get permanent advantage on at least 3 targets thanks to the Vex Weapon Mastery. The heavy crossbow and the longbow not having the Vex Weapon Mastery means that they don't need to take lucky, but of course they could. We see our 3 graphs on the side here, which just show the average DPR of a single round. I was calculating the DPR, like I said earlier, over the course of 3 rounds. So I basically took the number matching our target AC from the graph and multiplied it by 3. With the hand crossbow, we got 109.73. With the heavy crossbow, we got 63. And with the longbow, we got 67.89. Why did we get the numbers we did? Well, the main reason for the hand crossbow is because of the combo between the Vex Mastery, Elven Accuracy, and the bonus action of the Light Weapon property. The Vex Mastery says that as long as we hit an enemy with an attack, we gain advantage on our next attack against that enemy before the end of our next turn, and that can just keep going. This means that if we spend something like Heroic Inspiration or a luck point from the Lucky Origin feat on our first attack, we should be able to easily set up permanent advantage against a single target. This is where a bit of skewing came in because I assumed that we would always have advantage when attacking our enemy. Obviously, an enemy may die or you may switch targets, and that could change whether or not you actually have advantage, but all you need to do is hit once and then we just kind of snowball from there. With Elven Accuracy, this makes our hand crossbow extremely accurate, and against an AC of 18, that makes our DPR really increase compared to the other weapons. The other weapons hit hard, but they aren't as accurate. Another big contributor to our damage is Hunter's Mark. Hunter's Mark is quite literally doubling our damage, and without it, the hand crossbow is still extremely nasty because it's so accurate, but it won't pack as much of a punch. The last thing is the longbow. The reason it is outperforming the heavy crossbow here, even though the heavy crossbow is essentially the same type of weapon with a larger damage die, is because of the Piercer feat. The Piercer feat, on top of Champion Fighter's increased crit range, really does help boost our damage. This is probably the only time where the longbow is actually going to edge out the heavy crossbow just by a bit. Otherwise, for the rest of our builds, it's going to be pretty even. Next up, we are on to our Eldritch Knight. For the Eldritch Knight, one thing to note is that I did assume 18 intelligence for all of our builds, basically going with the assumption that we are dumping everything into dexterity and intelligence in order to get as much consistent damage as possible. Other stats don't really matter for these builds in particular. As well, the graphs on our right show the non-true strike attack. I'll get to exactly what I mean by that in a sec, but first let's look at our builds. You'll notice that all 3 of the builds have changed, so they are now all Fighter 8. Instead of jumping one more level into Ranger to pick up Hunter's Mark, they all will just take an extra level in Fighter to grab an ability score improvement / feat, and they're going to grab the Fey Touched feat, which gives them Hunter's Mark or Hex anyways. The reason I did this is because since the Eldritch Knight already has bell slots, I figured it was just easier to take the extra level, grab Fey Touched, improve our intelligence, hence why we were able to assume that all of our intelligences were 18, and then we'd still have our damage boosting spell anyways. The hand crossbow still has the Lucky Origin feat. We had to swap out Elven Accuracy for Warcaster. This is because I wanted to assume for the sake of these builds that we weren't able to actually cast True Strike, which we want to do with the Eldritch Knight War Magic feature if we were dual wielding 2 hand crossbows, because you need a hand free in order to cast a spell with somatic components. Our other 2 builds are largely the same though. The one thing about Great Weapon Master is that in the True Strike attack, I believe I did account for Great Weapon Master adding on to True Strike's damage. Now normally this is not possible because True Strike is a cantrip. Great Weapon Master has to be done with the attack action. However, the wording of the Great Weapon Master feat says that when you hit a creature as part of the attack action, you get to add your proficiency bonus to the damage of the heavy weapon. Because True Strike in this niche case is being used as part of the attack action thanks to War Magic, I assumed that this meant that Great Weapon Master would get added. If it doesn't get added, the heavy crossbow and the longbow will have slightly lower DPRs. For the sake of this, I assume that it was all good. That leads me into why the graphs show the non-True Strike attack instead of the True Strike attack. Because what I did was I calculated the DPR of a True Strike attack with our weapons, and then I calculated another DPR of just a regular attack with our weapons, and I added it together in order to get our actual DPR for a round, and then I multiplied that number by 3. So we have the hand crossbow in first with 99.13. We see that it takes a bit of a dip compared to our champion because we don't have elven accuracy anymore. We don't have that really high chance to hit, but we still do a fair amount of damage, and we're still in first because of the Vex Mastery, how accurate it is, how accurate we are, and we're still dealing a fair amount of damage, especially with the extra bonus action attack. The heavy crossbow and the longbow, however, have done more damage because we no longer have the increased crit range. Things have switched around where we have the heavy crossbow and the longbow swapping places, so the heavy crossbow is in second in terms of DPR, whereas the longbow is in third. Next up is our Battlemaster Fighter, and our Battlemaster Fighter, as I had sort of touched on in the Eldritch Knight, is a burst damage fighter, so the graphs on our right are going to show the burst round. However, looking at their builds, we're back to being very similar to the champion. All builds were Fighter 7 with a 1 level dip in Ranger. This was actually to pick up Hunter's Mark. Since we don't have built-in spell slots, we will want those free castings or spell slots to be able to cast Hunter's Mark and boost our damage. For the 3 graphs, we see their burst damage round, and as I had talked about, I wanted to make sure that we account for the burst damage that's possible without skewing the results completely. So 1 round of our 3 rounds of combat for our DPR is a burst damage round where we are using 2 superiority dice. That way the hand crossbow still doesn't pull ahead since they do have that bonus action attack. And with that, we can see that the hand crossbow is still in first because adding extra damage on top of our super accurate attacks against AC of 18 is just a straight up benefit. However, our other weapons aren't too shabby either. Now, the one thing to remember about Battlemaster here is that because we are only looking at level 8, obviously the scaling of the superiority die up to D10s or higher is not accounted for, and the level 10 Battlemaster feature Relentless, where we get a free 1d8 per turn every single turn, is also not accounted for here. Hunter Ranger was the most surprising of the builds. As we can see, all of our builds have changed to be full Ranger 8. This is because I wanted to get 2 feats on them and not multi-class, potentially losing that other feat. But otherwise, all builds are mostly the same in terms of feats. The difference in damage comes in with their bonuses. Hand crossbow and longbow both took Colossus Slayer for that free 1d8 once per turn in order to boost that consistent damage. The heavy crossbow, however, took Horde Breaker. Horde Breaker I accounted for by doing a full extra attack that did not benefit from Hunter's Mark and also did not benefit from Great Weapon Master. The reason I said it didn't benefit from Great Weapon Master was more to err on the side of caution, because Great Weapon Master, like I mentioned in Eldritch Knight, requires the hit to be part of the attack action. But Horde Breaker itself only requires a hit to trigger. This means you could use Horde Breaker even if you had a bonus action attack. So because the triggering for Great Weapon Master is more specific than Horde Breaker, I decided to err on the side of caution and not include it in the DPR of that attack specifically. It still is included in our main 2 attacks though. Also, because the heavy crossbow has the push mastery is why I'm taking Horde Breaker in the first place. I felt that being able to use the push mastery on our 2 main attacks from the attack action would be enough to set up the Horde Breaker attack and be able to permanently count us getting a 3rd attack the same way that I have assumed the hand crossbow has advantage for every single round. By doing that, we see that the hand crossbow is still in first with 117.18, and this is the highest DPR of all of our builds. But the heavy crossbow has increased greatly in terms of its DPR and has shot up to 97.5, and that is really awesome. The longbow, even though it's still in last, has also had a big increase, going up to 70.02. So overall, the Hunter Ranger is just a solid damage dealer. The one last thing I will say about the heavy crossbow, though, is that the Horde Breaker attack was still against an enemy with an AC of 18. The likelihood of 2 enemies having AC 18 and us trying to shoot them with our heavy crossbow is probably not super high, and knowing that we may end up likely facing enemies with lower ACs, especially if we're trying to get rid of minions with the Horde Breaker feature, the heavy crossbow's DPR is probably gonna shoot up in those situations, so it might be a bit of a sleeper build. Overall, I think if I was going to play a Hunter Ranger, I would grab a heavy crossbow and just try to be a minion slayer using the push mastery with Horde Breaker to dish out some major damage to those smaller enemies that we can just get rid of for our party. The Gloomstalker had some major changes in 2024, and like them or hate them, the Gloomstalker is now more of a consistent burst damage dealer rather than a first round burst damage dealer. Instead of the full extra attack on the first round, we now have 2d6 we can add to any attack we make, but only once per turn, and only a number of times equal to our wisdom modifier total. So, just like our Battlemaster, the graphs on the right show our burst damage round, and again, I did this mostly for formatting, because otherwise the slide would get very busy with the amount of graphs we would need to show on here, and really the burst damage is what is going to be increasing our DPR overall. As far as builds go, we're basically the exact same thing as the Hunter Ranger, it's just that our subclass has shifted. Everything was still Ranger 8, everything still had the feats they needed. Looking at that DPR, the hand crossbow still leads with 109.7, as it pretty much always is going to for these builds. Our heavy crossbow and longbow are more on par with the other builds now, with 66.67 and 64.12. And really, besides that, there's not much else to say here. The damage is pretty strong, we're on par with our other builds, and of course, Stalker's Fury, the 11th level feature, is not accounted for. This is when our burst damage would go up to 2d8, and we would get our own ranged cleave, like the Hunter's Horde Breaker, so our heavy crossbow may end up pulling ahead again. However, that feature is still unreliable because it is tied to Dreadful Strikes, and Dreadful Strikes are limited use burst damage features. Alright, on to Rogues. Rogues are a little weird because if you may have noticed, I was referring to just a rogue build earlier in the video, and this because I had kind of hand-waved them, viewing their play styles as being very similar, and figured their DPR wouldn't drastically change too much. Going through the builds though, I eventually felt that Thief deserved its own actual build because it has some special things we're going to have to talk about, and if Thief was getting their own, then of course Arcane Trickster and Assassin deserved their own builds as well. So looking at the Arcane Trickster, we can see how the rogue builds are different, and yet compared to the 3 subclasses, how they are the same. First off, for the hand crossbow, we have a build that is fully level 8 rogue. They still have the Lucky Origin feat, Crossbow Expert, and Elven Accuracy, because we want to use our bonus action to get that extra crossbow shot in order to have more chances to deliver our sneak attack. This does pay off as we are going to still have the highest DPR of the builds. However, the playing field is a little more evened out. And that is because with the heavy crossbow and the longbow, what they are doing is they are using True Strike as their action instead of taking the attack action. The reason for this is because if they were going to make one attack anyways, since they don't have extra attack, they would be better off just casting True Strike to get the extra damage from the cantrip. Now you'll notice I didn't put anywhere in the builds of where we can get True Strike from, but that's because for the Arcane Trickster, there's like 3 different possibilities, and for the Assassin, there'll at least be 2. We could get it from our Origin feat, we could get it from being an Elf, since you'll notice I did take Elven Accuracy on these 2 weapon builds, and I do the same in the Assassin, or we could get it specifically from being an Arcane Trickster. Either way, I assume we have True Strike for our other 2 weapon builds. And I took Elven Accuracy on both of them because we have the Steady Aim feature. The Steady Aim feature uses our bonus action to give us advantage on our next attack this turn. So now I assume that we will always have advantage with our heavy crossbow as well as our longbow, and that increased accuracy is what really helps level the playing field. Hand crossbow still edges out our other two builds because they have the second chance to deliver sneak attack, but otherwise, we're on even footing now. The longbow, since it has the lowest damage die without a second chance to use its damage, has the greatest increase thanks to elven accuracy, but it still is in last with 82.41, whereas the heavy crossbow has 85.65 and the hand crossbow has 90.45. Jumping really quickly to the assassin, again, the graphs will show the burst damage round because our first turn as an assassin is a burst damage round where we get some extra damage equal to our rogue level. The builds are all the same. The DPRs are still consistent with our Arcane Trickster. However, the numbers are just increased. Our hand crossbow now has 98.325, again because they have two chances to deliver that sneak attack as well as burst damage from being an assassin, whereas the heavy crossbow has 92.204, and the longbow is still trailing behind just a little bit with 88.965. And of course, same as the Arcane Trickster, the hand crossbow is actually ignoring True Strike in favor of the two chances to use their sneak attack. Alright, now let's look at the Thief Rogue. The Thief Rogue is really swingy, and the reason is because of Fast Hands. Fast Hands, for those that don't know, allows us to use a spell scroll as a bonus action. The reason is, spells that require an action to cast actually require the magic action, and Fast Hands says that we can use a bonus action to use a magic item that requires the magic action to use. A spell scroll with a spell that has the casting time of one action is a magic item that requires the magic action in order to be used. At first, I was kind of overthinking this and didn't think it actually worked, but after relooking at it and some clarification, it does make a lot more sense. Now, what this allows us to do as a Thief Rogue is hold our action on our turn to cast True Strike off of our turn and get Sneak Attack a second time in a round that way, while using our bonus action and a spell scroll to cast True Strike on our turn and still get Sneak Attack. If I were to assume that we could consistently do this every single round and get 2 sneak attacks off at all times, Thief Rogue takes the crown for best archer by a mile, there's no question. The hand crossbow alone would have a DPR of about 140 to 150. I feel it's a little unfair to assume that we can do this at all times because of 2 main reasons. Number 1, how many scrolls do we actually have on us at any given moment? It is still a finite resource even if cantrip scrolls are so cheap to make. Second, are we really guaranteed to get sneak attack off on both attacks every round? There are a lot of variables there in enemies moving, perhaps dying, allies moving, and the only reliable way to get sneak attack off 2 times in a round is with advantage, which of course the Vex Mastery unfairly skews towards our hand crossbow. To get around this, I have a bit of a compromise. I ran the Thief Rogue as a bit of a burst damage dealer. I assume we had 1 scroll of True Strike to get to use in order to get our big burst round where we can get sneak attack 2 times in that round, and after that, the next 2 rounds of our 3 rounds of DPR are us just using Steady Aim as our bonus action and casting True Strike as our action. Looking at the builds for that, our hand crossbow is still a Rogue 8 and gets Crossbow Expert as well as Elven Accuracy because the Vex Mastery kind of demands that we try to take these, whereas the heavy crossbow and the longbow both are Rogue 7, Fighter 1 in order to get proficiency, as well as the archery fighting style, and they don't actually take Elven Accuracy here because the only times we're using it is on our regular turns, not our burst turn. So I wanted to make sure that we were going to account for the burst turn first and foremost, rather than the other turns. The only time this gets a little weird is with the heavy crossbow and the longbow, since the attacks that they make with their held action off of their turn do not benefit from the advantage, whereas the hand crossbows does, because again of the Vex Mastery. This led us to see that the hand crossbow has a DPR of 99.48, whereas the heavy crossbow has a DPR of 84.54, and the longbow has a DPR of 82.69. So still very close together, still again very similar to our other rogues, but the hand crossbow still pulls ahead just because of the increased accuracy, even though all rogues are getting that first burst round where they get 2 sets of sneak attack. Finally, we have the monk. The monk I had added as an homage to our build from last week, which was the bow monk. I didn't really expect monk to stand out, and it certainly didn't, but it was still fun to explore and add in. I did assume that we were a Kensei monk, since the Kensei monk is the main monk subclass that actually gets any bonuses to ranged combat. And looking at this right away, you'll notice that the heavy crossbow is not included. This is because the heavy crossbow is the one weapon that we have been using so far that does not count as a monk weapon or Kensei weapon. The hand crossbow and the longbow can both be made into Kensei weapons and gain the bonus damage from Kensei shot, should a monk want to use that, because the hand crossbow automatically fits the criteria, and the longbow is the one exception in terms of heavy weapons. So this just made the most sense to omit the heavy crossbow entirely, instead of still trying to get it to work, since it just wasn't going to get any bonuses to its damage. Now, also looking at the graphs here, the monk I did run as a burst damage dealer, but the graphs only show the ranged attacks. What I mean by this is I assumed that we had a burst round where we were actually adding flurry of blows into that round. I wanted to do this because the monk is the one class that can excel at just swapping on a dime between ranged and melee combat. Other archer builds will probably want to try and disengage, get away, or pick up the sharpshooter feat to be able to shoot enemies that are point blank. The monk can just start throwing unarmed strikes around. Because of this, I didn't want to show the burst round for the monk because that would include those unarmed strikes from flurry of blows. Instead, I'd rather just show off in terms of the graphs the actual range damage that they're putting out. So for the hand crossbow, that's again us just dual wielding hand crossbows and using our bonus action to make an extra shot, whereas with the longbow, our bonus action is dedicated to Kensei's shot to get an extra d4 on all our attacks. Even with that Kensei shot and Great Weapon Master though, the longbow still falls behind with a DPR of 58.2, but that is the total DPR across all 3 rounds, so yes, that does include our Flurry of Blows round. Whereas the hand crossbow, with the Flurry of Blows round again, is up to 69.567. This is a little bit weird because the Vex Mastery on our burst round would carry over to the first unarmed strike from Flurry of Blows, but get lost after that, and we'd have to reset up Vex again. I mostly accounted for this by not accounting for it at all on the unarmed strikes and only ever assuming we had advantage on our ranged attacks. Overall, the monk was still somewhat on par with our other ranged damage dealers, getting about a 60 DPR, but it was unfortunately by far the weakest. And other than that, that's all our builds. We've finally made it to the end. Phew, quick summary of our findings on the builds. Elven Accuracy plus the Vex property overperforms against enemies with higher ACs. That makes us a super deadly single target damage dealer. It's just almost unbeatable. Where it does get beaten is against enemies with lower ACs, where Great Weapon Master and just larger damage dice in general come out swinging like a truck, and the playing field really gets leveled out. Obviously, if I were to redo these damage calculations with an AC of 15 as our target AC in mind, then everything would change. I don't think it would be too drastic. I do know that all of our heavy crossbow and longbow DPRs would go up, while our hand crossbow DPR would stay more or less the same. Also, in terms of DPR, the builds that have lower DPR on paper generally make up for it through control or versatility. They have other things they can do that weren't accounted for. I never accounted for the slow mastery in any of our builds, and I only accounted for the push mastery one time, and that was with the Ranger Horde Breaker. If you wanted to grab a terrain spell, which I had said I wasn't including in the calculations, then you totally could grab something like Spike Growth, throw it down, take a heavy crossbow, and shoot an enemy so that they get pushed through Spike Growth, and that will get you extra DPR, no question. I would still count that more as versatility or control rather than just raw DPR from being an archer, but for what it's worth, it is something to keep in mind. The last thing is Rogue. Rogue feels like they are more middle of the pack from the way I had calculated them, but honestly, they are a bit swingy. If they are able to get out 2 sneak attacks per round, which could be done through like a Battlemaster's Commanding Strike or anything else that lets them do a reaction attack, that would significantly boost their DPR, and you can make a solid argument that they could be the best archer build in terms of DPR. But they do get other interesting features like Cunning Strike to make up for that more middling DPR. The other thing is that even though our hand crossbow came out first in all of our builds, I will say it is heavily restricted in that it needs 2 feats in order to accomplish this, plus potentially getting Hunter's Mark or Hex somehow. The other weapons, like the heavy crossbow and specifically the longbow, are both a little more open in that they don't require as many feats to make their builds work. Really, all they desperately need for increasing their DPR is Great Weapon Master, but you could pick up any other feats you wanted to just have an interesting character and not be tied in to direct damage. I never picked Sharpshooter with any of these builds. That's because it doesn't actually, on paper, change our DPR, but in practice, it really kinda does. The fact that you can extend range, ignore cover, and fire in melee all would increase our DPR at the table, but it doesn't really do it on the spreadsheet because we can't really account for that and calculate it unless we were throwing in cover against like a whole bunch of different enemies and we had to redo the entire builds. I would rather not do that, but just keep that in mind that Sharpshooter, even though I never picked it up and looked at it really, is a solid option in practice. Overall, with all this said, I feel confident that there is no one specific absolute best archer, because at any given point in time, any of these archer builds could be better than others. There are just some that have leaned more into being more powerful on paper based on the specific restrictions we put on our calculations. And I will take full responsibility for that. So I obviously promised a build with this request, and I intend to present it. I'm going to present the one that I found the most fun to build that did some good consistent damage, but obviously it probably isn't the best archer overall, but in my mind, I think it would be pretty fun to play. And as the thumbnail would suggest, we are going champion fighter, dual wielding hand crossbows. It's simple, it's strong, and it lets me play a Diablo 3 demon hunter. I just think that's super cool. If it isn't your cup of tea, that's perfectly fine, but for what it's worth, let's look at what we get with that build beyond just level 8. Tier 1 is pretty straightforward, 5 levels of fighter to actually get extra attack and crossbow expert. Prior to that, we're kind of lacking in damage actually, and we don't really come online until past level 5. We also pick up champion as our subclass. Champion and Vex go together like bread and butter just because we have increased crit range and almost permanent advantage, at least against single target enemies. With the lucky feat, we can basically use lucky to set up our first attack, hopefully hit the enemy, get Vex, and just keep going against that enemy until they're down, then use our second luck point to go onto the next enemy, so on and so forth. As soon as we hit level 6 in tier 2 though, we gain Elven Accuracy for even more accuracy, and we become even stronger, especially with consistent super advantage. Eventually, we take a 1 level dip into Ranger to pick up Hunter's Mark to just boost our damage again against a single target enemy, which is what we want to do anyways. And from there, the path is pretty straightforward. We're just continuing with Fighter for the majority of tier 3 and 4, more feats to either boost our damage, add some flavor, or give us more durability. And eventually, at level 10 Champion Fighter, we gain Heroic Warrior. Heroic Warrior gives us Heroic Inspiration once per turn, and now we no longer need to use luck points to set up our permanent super advantage. We are guaranteed 1 attack with advantage, super advantage because of Elven Accuracy, every turn because of Heroic Warrior. That is powerful. At this point, there's really no excuse for us not to have advantage when we're attacking an enemy. Finally, at the end of tier 4, we can either continue up Fighter, or we can jump into Ranger to grab an extra fighting style, so we could have 3 potentially, since we're a champion fighter with multi-classing, and we could get a subclass for even more damage, such as our Hunter Ranger with Colossus Slayer, or Horde Breaker even. If we time our 2 final ASIs just right, we could even pick up 2 epic boon feats, and that would make us extremely powerful. If you've made it this far and you've watched the entire video, or you just skipped to the build at the very end, I do want to say thank you so much. From the bottom of my heart, I know that this isn't a video that I typically do, and it is a lot longer than normal. I appreciate you for sticking it all the way through, or just checking it out. And with that said, we're finally officially done. Let me know what you thought of the video, or what you think the absolute best archer would be, or what archer type of build you are most excited to play with the 2024 rules. And also let me know if you think that there would be any 2014 subclasses that could pull significantly ahead of our other builds. I'm not so sure if there's anything that would really stand out more than any others, but maybe there is, and maybe I have overlooked a hidden gem. Thank you so much for coming on the journey with me, and I hope to see you in the next one.